Hello, everybody, and welcome to City of Literature at Norfolk and Norwich Festival 2021. City of Literature is a Norfolk and Norwich Festival and National Centre for Writing presentation programmed by the National Centre for Writing. My name is Flo Reynolds, and I'm Programme Manager at National Centre for Writing. I want to thank you for joining us for this very special event in which we welcome Abir Mukherjee and Derek Owusu. Abir and Derek will discuss their recent commissions as part of the Open Doors programme, in which they explore how recent events have impacted on their creativity. They will be joined by Heather Parry in the chair. Very special thanks go to Arts Council England, whose Ambition for Excellence Fund has made this event possible. I hope you enjoy the event, and without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Abir, Derek and Heather.
Thank you, Flo, for that lovely introduction. I'm Heather Parry, and today I'm speaking to Abir Mukherjee and Derek Owusu about the pieces they've written for this series. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about them. Abir Mukherjee is the best-selling author of the award-winning Wyndham Banerjee series of crime novels set in Raj-era India. He is a two-time winner of the CWA Historical Dagger and has won the Wilbur Smith Award for Adventure Writing. His books have also been shortlisted for the CWA Gold Dagger and the HWA Gold Crown. Abir grew up in Scotland, actually in Hamilton, not far from where I am today, and now lives in Surrey with his wife and two sons. Derek Owusu is a writer, poet, and podcaster from North London. He discovered his passion for literature at the age of 23 while studying exercise science at university. Unable to afford a change of degree, Derek began reading voraciously and sneaking into English lit lectures at the University of Manchester. Derek edited and contributed to SAFE on Black British men reclaiming space. That reminds me, his first solo work won the Desmond Elliott Prize in 2020. Thanks so much for being here today, guys. I don't usually ask this, but it seems quite pertinent as a way to start this conversation. How have you been? Derek, let's start with you. How are you? How's the year been for you?
I'm okay, thank you. At the moment, the year was, when you say the year, are we talking from March 2020 up until now, or are we talking from January 2021 to?
That's funny. I am talking about March 2020. It's funny that the concept of time is shifted to kind of pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. Yeah, let's go with the last 12 months.
Okay. Yeah, I've been okay. The first lockdown, people call it lockdown 1, was difficult. It was quite difficult, just because I think I expected it to be easy, and it just wasn't. But it allowed me to develop the tools I needed to cope with the second lockdown and then the third one. So the second and third lockdown, although I was in a different place, I did find it a lot easier to do everything that was going on. I was able to manage what I was looking at on the internet better, the news. Because during first lockdown, literally the first thing that I would do every morning is check the infection toll and the death toll and those kind of things. And it just, it just wasn't really good for my mental health, constantly checking in on death and disaster the moment that I wake up in the morning. So I was able to manage that during the later lockdown. So yeah, I'm not too bad at the moment, to answer your question.
I definitely did the checking the horrible news every moment of every day thing as well, and yeah, it's not good for creative work, I found as well. Abir, how about you? How's your last 12 months been?
Well, I mean, it's I'm just listening to what Derek was saying, and there are many echoes there. I think when the first lockdown hit, from a point of view, I couldn't write anything in March and halfway into April. I think most creative people had that feeling. I mean, how do you get the creative side of your brain working when there's just so much negativity, so many crises around the world? And like Derek, it took me a while to develop the sort of tools to at least get into a position where I was able to write again. For me, I actually feel quite guilty about the last 12 months. I look at what's happening. I look at the suffering, and I realize just how lucky I and my family have been. We moved out of London about 6 months before lockdown. We were in a small flat, family of four in a small flat in East London. And we moved out just 6 months before, and luckily we have a small garden, we have a bit of space, there are lots of parks around here. That made a huge difference. From a sort of work, neither myself nor my wife were particularly affected by it. The biggest issue for us was, relatives and the health of our sort of elderly relatives, but everybody seems to have been okay. So I actually feel, from a personal point of view, it's been. I feel guilty because we've got through relatively unscathed, and while I give thanks for that, it is something that it's a bit like survivor's guilt, I suppose, on a much smaller level. It's what I feel. I feel I haven't done enough. When you see this suffering, and you think, well, what else should I be doing? And that for me has been the biggest issue. On the positive side, I have to say, because we had my family here, I have my wife and my kids, the people that I fight with the most, it's actually shown me, it's actually deepened our family, to be honest with you. I found that our emotional support bubble, again, we were lucky because we were together. I wonder how it would be for an individual who is shielding, who has nobody around. From our point of view, the relationship between my wife and I became stronger through this year. I think it's probably Stockholm syndrome on her part, but that's where we are.
Yeah, I can relate to a lot of that as well, especially the inability to write for like the first couple of months. But for me, that came through in inability to read fiction through that period as well. It was like I couldn't pull my head out of the real world, and it felt wrong to do so, and I couldn't concentrate on anything outside of what was immediately happening. And then I actually pushed myself to write for like the whole month of May, just because I felt I was losing myself. I felt like I was losing the ability to be who I am in my career, but personally as well. Derek, how is that something you felt as well? The thing we've been asked to talk about today is the pressure of the previous year as writers. So how have you felt that?
Yeah, I wasn't able to write at all. But I didn't have any desire to write. I couldn't read either. I found it really difficult to focus on a book, which was more painful for me than an inability to write, because I see myself as a reader first, and I feel really uncomfortable when I don't read just for a day, and I couldn't do it. So that was really distressing for me. I think when lockdown started started easing a little bit, and I was able to go to parks and things, I remember I think this was maybe August or something, and I hadn't written anything for a while. And I was at a friend's house, just in their kitchen, and I suddenly just had this feeling, that I really missed my mum, and I just had this overwhelming feeling of, damn, I really love my mum. And then I thought, wow, I've got another book to write, and I just said to my friend, I've got to go, And I just left. I just got in a cab. I left. I came home. I bought a bottle of gin, and I just started writing. and that was that. And I didn't stop until I'd finished the book, which is a poetry collection, which is going to be published next spring.
Amazing. So you had that same sort of, everything was becoming pent up, and then you kind of vomited it out in the same way, like a lot of writing all at once. Abir, is that something you've experienced as well?
I have to say, yeah. I mean, not gin. I went for whiskey, obviously, because I'm a wee bit older than Derek, bit more mature. But yes, I mean, I think for me it was May. Like you, it wasn't as late as August. It was May, and I probably wrote more last May than I have done, for any month that I can remember, without a deadline being immediately, afterwards. It was probably the most productive period I've had, and maybe, as you say, Heather, maybe it was because of everything that was pent up. It was also all the frustrations of the previous few months, the anger, all of that was coming out on the page, and I think that was really useful. It was cathartic. Of course, and then the summer comes and I'm back to square one. But yes, I think there was definitely an impact. There was this impact of, and I can understand why none of us were able to write in the immediate aftermath. I think for me, what's surprising is you've both said that you couldn't read either. And I can't actually remember what the impact on my reading was, but that to me is fascinating, because it sounds like this became so consuming that the things that make us who we are, the reading, the writing, the things that are the expressions of us, to just be put on hold.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I could read non-fiction, but I couldn't read fiction. So non-fiction, a lot of political books, it felt like that was the right kind of engagement. But I couldn't even really watch TV. We were having like philosophy hours over a cocktail. I think we've never done these before. We've never done this. But it felt like we had to do something that engaged with the world we were living in at that moment. And I wonder if you've both felt the need to write more politically or even more personally than you have before. Derek, how about you?
No, it was the complete opposite for me. In general, I don't really like writing politically. I don't know why. I really don't like politics. I can't really get my head around politics, to be honest with you, in terms of, positioning, and just very, very clear that people are outright lying, but we still support them. I just can't get my head around it. It seems like it's a game that everybody's participating in, and I just don't really want to participate in it. Although of course I do vote. So yeah, it never occurred even during the pandemic. It never occurred to me to, feel like I needed to write more politically, or even read political books or anything like that. I mean, I couldn't read anything, fiction or non-fiction. But obviously, me saying, I didn't feel the need to write politically. I mean, the very act of me writing what I write is political anyway. I'm very aware of that. What I mean is that I guess kind of, overt politicizing what it is that I'm writing, I guess. That's what I don't like doing. If I'm reading a novel, for example, and I can even sense a little bit of the author's politics coming through in the narrative, it just frustrates me and I don't want to read it anymore. So, and I wouldn't want to do that to anybody.
So when you say you've gone kind of the opposite, have you brought your writing sort of a lot more in? You mentioned your mum and how your mum was the catalyst for your period of writing. So does that mean you've brought it more inwards than before?
No, not at all, actually. Because although my mum was the inspiration for me writing this new book, it's not about her, because I don't know anything about her, and that was the point. I just thought, I don't know anything about my mother. She's of a generation where she doesn't really talk about her past or what it was like for her when she first came into the country, because she just feels like, I'm her son and I don't need to know any of that. That's her burden to bear. So I just thought, okay, if she won't tell me, I'll just imagine the life of, a newly arrived West African female immigrant, what it was like for her when she came over young, where she worked, what she did, the kind of people she met, the way she fell in love and all of these kind of things. Because, yeah, I just really felt like, my mom's history, my aunties, uncles and stuff is not very heavily documented in fiction. West African lives in Britain are not really depicted in fiction all that much. And I was very aware of that. And I was very aware that I didn't know much about my mom either. So I imagine that a lot of other people didn't know much about their older West African families as well. And I know it's not reserved for just for West African families, because I've spoken to other writers and they're kind of like, yeah, I don't know anything about my mum either. And she will never tell me. So I thought it really felt like something that I needed to write. And I guess all of this kind of was probably bubbling in my subconscious, and then just that kind of overwhelming feeling towards my mother just made me think, okay, let me get this down on paper and let me not waste any time. So that was a really roundabout way of answering the question.
I actually feel, Abir, I feel that you can probably relate a lot. I know that's kind of a catalyst for a lot of what you've written.
Yeah, before that, I would say it wasn't a roundabout answer at all, Derek. I thought that was really moving. But yeah, to answer your question, for me, everything I write stems from anger and it stems from politics. Everything I write, even though it's fiction, has its wellspring in politics and what has happened, and what it means to be British, or growing up in a country that doesn't see you quite as its own. That is at the heart of everything I've written to date. It's about wanting to shout about the injustices and that are hiding in plain sight. Even this week we're hearing stories, or we're finding out that World War I ethnic minority, people that died fighting for this country have not been honored. We're 100 years on and we're talking about this, where people who have the wrong skin color are treated as somehow less human. And yet we hold ourselves up as this, as always being on the side of angels, as being this paragon of virtue in this country. And that's always what's animated me, because, and I'm sure, Derek will understand this, and Derek's mother certainly will, because she's probably closer to my age than Derek is. The fact that you are aware of this other narrative. And here's the difference, I think, between, Derek's case and mine. I grew up in a family which talked about its time in Britain. My parents really didn't talk about their time in India, because what my father lived through, especially in the 40s, was a terrible time. There was, and so much killing, so much death, so much that stemmed from empire and the escape, the fleeing from empire. So much that happened in that point, that happened on our watch and happened because of our leaders that we have washed our hands of. That has always animated me. And so everything I write has been inspired by, I'm going to call it hypocrisy. It's an unconscious hypocrisy. Too often we do not know enough about our past, about what Britain is and what British people have done. And we cloak ourselves in this righteousness which we don't deserve. And I just feel that if we knew about our history, we would be far less likely to make the mistakes and act with the hubris that we do. So everything I write, even before the pandemic, stemmed from this anger. The thing I would say is, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, and the thing that hit me was that, in the previous 10 years or whatever, whenever you switched on a TV and you saw somebody who looked like me, they were either playing a terrorist or a shopkeeper. And suddenly at the beginning of the pandemic, every brown face you saw on TV was a doctor or a nurse. And that to me, I thought, well, if there's one good thing coming out of the pandemic, at least we're being portrayed in a better way. So for me, personally, the pandemic didn't have a huge impact. What's really made me happy is that the pandemic has there's so much that's happened worldwide during this period, be it, the George Floyd killing, the re-emergence of Black Lives Matter, because it was there. It's been there for years. You've had Colin Kaepernick, we had all that, and then it subsided, and now it came back into the public gaze. All of that, I think, has a link to what's happened in society over the last year, a willingness to look at things afresh. And for me, that's probably one of the, if we're going to take a silver lining, if we're going to take something positive out of this last year, it is the fact that we are beginning to face up justices and to see the systemic nature of them. But on the other side, there's still the fight back. We have things like the Sewell report, by the government. The fact that they're making it a greater criminal offence to bring down a statue than it is to rape someone in terms of the prison sentences. That to me is the backlash against what's happening. And I've forgotten the question, but this is what's been motivating me this last year. That's a roundabout answer, Derek.
I love the roundabout answers. Keep them coming. The lovely Peggy Hughes, who works at the Writers' Centre, sent me a review this week in which it said a band had been, and I'll quote now, energized by the mirror of their own internal weather in world events. And Abir, this made me think of your piece where you've written, and I'll quote you here, "You might say I grew up in a microclimate, somewhere up high on a cliff where the winds are often more turbulent than they are in the green pastures and sunlit uplands where most of the folk live." Do you feel that your exposure to these turbulent winds is now being seen? And is that energizing your work? And how is it changing what you're writing?
That's a really good question. Do I feel more seen? What I feel like is that there's more of us up there. There are more of us who have a different viewpoint because we sit up here. We see Britain in a different way. We see ourselves, our Britishness, as different. We understand. We have perspectives. What has really charged me is the fact that there are so many of us, and we are becoming more accepted, that our viewpoints, rather than being fringe or revisionist, are actually just as valid as the views from the sunlit uplands that the vast majority of people in this country occupy. Has it changed what I'm writing? Yes, it has. I write historical fiction. I have the 5th book in the historical series is coming out this year. But what I'm writing now is something which is set in the current day. It is, and it deals with radicalization. It deals with what it means to be part of our societies, British and American. And for me, radicalization, and we've seen it this year, we saw it with the storming of the Capitol. Radicalization is like a horseshoe where the two ends of the spectrum are closer to each other than they are to the middle. So it's somebody who's an alt-right radical fanatic has very little indifferent to somebody who may be an Islamic radical. The causes are the same. The viewpoints are actually much closer than they are to the middle. And that's something that's fascinated me. And so what I'm writing now is about that.
That sounds fascinating. I can't wait to read both of these works.
There'll be a lot of dead bodies on the way, so it'll still be the sort of thing I write.
Derek, how about you? Do you feel that if we use the phrase again, your internal weather is being mirrored in the current world and kind of how things are in the last 12 months?
Yeah, I do. But then I'm a bit more cynical in the sense that, British people can talk about the weather and not really give a damn about it. What they mean something completely different. So if people are discussing the lives of, Black people, people of color, in a way that seems significant, realistically, they don't care. And I do get that feeling a lot. There's been a lot of conversation that, a lot of books about race have kind of shot up like bestseller charts and all of these kind of things. And there's been a lot of posts on social media, this is like the anti-racist starter kit. These are the books you should read to become anti-racist and so on. And obviously people are purchasing these books. And then, the question you have to ask is, okay, you're buying them. Are you actually reading them? Or you're just buying them so that you can post them on social media that you have them. Therefore, you can never accuse me of racism, because to a lot of people, being accused of racism is worse than racism itself, which is very bizarre. But that's just how it is a lot of the time. So I'm a lot more cynical, and I think because having spoken to a lot of people, and Abir will probably be able to say, yeah, this is true, that there's cycles, cycles of optimism. Okay, things are changing, and then suddenly the conversation just stops for like 5 years. Something else happens, and then it's re-energized again, and then again and again and again. But a lot of people are saying this time it feels a bit different. Angela Davis even said it on TV, and she's been through, a lot. She's seen a lot. She even said, this feels a bit different somehow. Something feels like it's actually changed. She wasn't able to pinpoint what that was. I don't know what exactly that was. I can't say that I personally feel that, but people more experienced than me are saying that, no, something is changing. That allows me to have a tiny bit of optimism through my cynicism.
Sometimes you can't see whether it's happening while it's happening. It's only in retrospect that you are able to perceive a shift, I think. Abir, do you feel a little bit more positive, or are you on the cynical side as well?
Well, you know me, Heather. I am an optimist. I'm a perennial optimist. Probably, and you know why? I mean, another author asked me, a white author asked me, why are you not more angry? And maybe it's partly because I'm older now. I am less angry than I was, but anger is tiring. Anger just is exhausting. And while it's valid, and it, I completely support people like Derek who are young. The young should be angry, but also I think time gives you a sense of perspective. I do think things change, and you can change people's minds. I think it's a 30, 40-year cycle. If you go back to the 30s and you see Oswald Mosley and the fascists, and we had that then, but people stood against it. They weren't perfect, but people stood up. In the East End of London, they stood up. Across the country, they stood up. And then again in the 70s, we had Enoch Powell, we had the National Front, we had the Rivers of Blood speech. But people, the vast majority of people are, I think, decent. They may not have a view of their own history which is accurate, but I think most people have their hearts in the right place, regardless of race or colour. And I think every time this happens, and we're seeing it again now, it's not just a British thing. We are populism, fear of the other rise everywhere across the world. We're seeing it in America, we're seeing it in Europe, we're seeing it in India with the rise of Hindu nationalism. So these are problems that we face, and I think every cycle things get slightly better because we'll fight this battle. I think we'll always be fighting this battle. It will never be over. Mm-hmm. But every time we fight it, if we make 5%, 10% progress, it makes the next battle easier. And whereas 15, 20 years ago, I thought these battles are done. The things that my mother would tell me about, that we are here only at the forbearance of the white majority, things that I didn't, take to heart because I grew up after the 70s. I didn't remember that. But these things are coming back. We see the Windrush scandal. We see, Shamima Begum, who has her citizenship taken away. When that is something, we may disagree with everything she's done. We might find her abhorrent, but we cannot take away her birthright. We're only doing that because of the color of her skin and where her parents came from. So these battles are ones that we're going to have to fight. We're going to have to fight them generation after generation. Next time we fight them, and we'll win them, I'm sure of it. But next time we fight them, Derek's going to be my age, right? And he's a wee bit more laid back. But right now, he's right to be angry. He's right.
This actually brings me to something you wrote in your piece, Derek, which was, you said, once again, creativity and putting things into words has done exactly the opposite of what it is supposed to do. You were saying there about the anti-racist books and the kind of surge to put out all this anti-racist content, even on social media, the Instagram little informatics that went so viral. I think there's a lot of responding immediately through words. But it feels like, as a writer, you're feeling that kind of as an anxiety. Like, we're used to experiencing, thinking, responding, redrafting, rewriting, taking our time. And the times that we live in seems to be pushing us to take less time and respond quicker through writing as well as just as people. Do you feel that tension in your work at the minute and in yourself as a writer?
Yeah, I always have, because I feel like I'm an impressionistic writer, if that makes sense. Like, I try to write an emotion on the page, and I think when you start trying to do that, the outcome is always going to be less meaningful than the feeling that you're feeling. It's impossible to capture it in words. And I think that goes for, the experiences that people face, people of color face in the UK as well. It's really difficult to explain to somebody how it actually feels. Even the microaggressions, as we call them, the kind of minor things that people would kind of be surprised, like, that's not racist? Do you know what I mean? But it's really hard to explain how something so minor can have such a huge impact on your mood or your day to day. So in a way, the anti-racist books are in a way helpful, but in a way they're just a failing endeavor. I personally see, and I don't have the answers. I don't know what would need to happen in order for people to actually, I guess, kind of change in the way that I personally would see as meaningful. A lot of the time, what I see is performance happening. So the black squares thing on social media, and Abby is right. I guess these people, their heart is in the right place, but they just literally have no idea what to do and how to do it. So they just kind of these gestures just get thrown out that don't actually mean much. So it's difficult. It's such a hard question to answer. How exactly do we create change through literature, through writing, through books? I know the romantic narrative is that literature can change the world, poetry can change the words, and those kind of things. But I mean, if we're keeping it real, like, come on, don't be ridiculous. They can influence the minds of certain people, and of course, I mean, like most of the massive atrocities that have happened in the world have taken place because someone has been influenced by a book, or so on and so forth. I think his name Mussolini. Is his name Mussolini? I think he used to talk about the Republic by Plato a lot. Obviously, Hitler was influenced by that. Obviously, the that fallacious book, The Protocols of the Elder Zion. So these works, these pieces of writing can have influence on people, but the people have to actually do the work. People actually have to take action, and they shouldn't have to rely on a book. They shouldn't have to rely on a book to tell them what to do, to tell them what the right thing is to do. I don't think I'm going too far as to say, you should be able to know that you shouldn't treat certain people a particular way. You should treat everybody with dignity and respect. Do you know what I mean? You shouldn't need a book to tell what the decent thing is to do. Again, I'm just rambling. Sorry.
But it's quality ramble, Derek. So, Abir, is that something you
I
feel
think we
as
should
well
have
that? Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, I think we should have a podcast called Quality Ramble. I think that's a great idea. Sorry, to sort of pick up. To pick up on what Derek was saying, I agree. I think the issue is, who do we see as people? Who do we see as human? And this is the thing, and this goes back to it, whether you call it, there are degrees of this. At one extreme, you have, racists who basically do not see other people of a different color or creed or race as equal to them. There's this issue of who is human. But I think even on a day-to-day level, we have people who may think of themselves as perfectly good, decent people do not always place others on the same level of humanity as them. And I've talked about it before already today, but let's look at this issue of the war graves. People that fought and died for this country, given, even in death, they were not given the same status as white people. They were somehow less human, less worthy of having their sacrifice noted. And these were the most, these were people who gave their lives for this country and the ideals of this country, and we didn't even honor them. If somebody thought that was wrong, they would have done something about it. It wouldn't have taken 100 years. But obviously, at the time, it was perfectly acceptable to see these people as somehow less human. The animus for my writing is the Bengal famine of 1943, where 3 million Indians were starved to death in a man-made famine. There were bumper crops, bumper harvests for the 2 previous years. But because the Japanese were at the gates of India, the food was taken away, the riverine transport was taken away. This food rotted in granaries while 3 million people died, and Churchill whitewashed it. It was allowed to happen because these Indians were seen as somehow less human than the white people in Britain who couldn't survive if there was starvation through a U-boat blockade. That is a fundamental issue, and we're not over it. We're not over it. We're seeing it on the streets of America, where a man can stand on another man's neck for 9 minutes because he doesn't see him as somehow as human as himself. And until now, juries have time and again allowed people like that to go free. Why? Because they do not think that the victim is as human as the person committing him. And we need to get away from that. So that, to me, is the fundamental problem. It's who do we see as human? And we may think of ourselves as liberal, and yet we have the same problems. The story that comes to my mind is the story of that woman in Central Park. A middle-class woman who works for a big Wall Street firm. She was walking her dog off the leash in Central Park. A black man called her up on it, and she threatened to call the police. She did call the police on him, using that power, knowing that a white woman calling the police about a black man could lead to his death. She used that as a threat, and yet she was, if you looked at her social media, and this is something that Derek picked up on her social media, she was as right on and woke as anyone else. It comes down to what we really view as human, and a lot of that is subconscious. I'm ranting now. I do apologize.
No, it makes me think of when we talk about imperialism, and almost all imperialist nations rely or have relied on an unpeopled people. So a nation of people somewhere that we have decided as imperialist nations don't have the same rights and status as humans, like you say. And, that was the Bengal famine, but that's also kind of the war in Iraq. And these things, if you bring them up, people get very angry if you bring them up. They say, why are you still talking about that? Oh my God, come on. Why are we still talking about that? Well, Churchill did all these great things. And I think if we can say there has been a positive over the last 12 months, it's that the people are starting to be able to hold these two positions together, perhaps. Perhaps I'm being slightly over positive now. But I feel like these aren't fringe positions now, that this is not okay that, millions of people were allowed to starve for the sake of white people in Britain. I feel like that's all this conversation is coming to the fore, perhaps a little bit more than it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And yeah, perhaps it is on a cycle, but perhaps we're pushing it along a little bit more than we did on the last cycle. Abir, this is like something you've brought to your piece. This is something you brought to this commission. You're very real and very understandable anger about these kind of things. Was that something you stood back and thought, I'm going to bring that into this commission, or did it come out? Did you have a different angle you were going to take, or was it always this one?
I started off thinking I was going to talk about populism. As I said, I always write. It's basic therapy for me. I write about whatever is angering me, and the things that when the commission was announced, the things that were angering me were the issues of populism, and I wanted to look at those. But as I started writing, it was the issues around George Floyd which were coming back. It were the issues around statues. It was the issues around ourselves and how we view our history, and that's always been personal to me. It has. I agree with you. I think with every year, with every voice, we make some progress. And yeah, it's like the tide; it'll go back out again. But next time it has to go in a bit further. Maybe there's a bit of erosion against these cliffs of of our set way of doing things, our set beliefs. If every time that tide or that wave just pushes a wee bit further, maybe one day we will get there. But it's not going to happen in my lifetime. But which is why I'm a bit less angry about it than I used to be. But we are making progress, as you say. It's that 2 or 3 or 4%. Every conversation like this, where people of different backgrounds, different races can have this conversation and say, look, this is my lived experience. We both, grew up in Glasgow. One of my overriding memories is the fact that walking out of a bar or a pub at 12 o'clock at night on Buchanan Street or Sauchiehall Street or whatever, and passing a group of white youths, it didn't matter if they were the nicest people in the world. I would always have that fear in my head of, these people might have some irrational hatred of me. And that colors your entire life. And I can understand when women say these things of groups of men, I can understand it because I've lived some of that. I've not lived all of it, but I have a middle ground. I was talking to a good friend of mine who is white, middle class, and in many respects, we're very similar people with the same outlook. But he takes for granted things that I would never be able to do because he's had the ability as a white man in this country. He's given the benefit of the doubt. He can go anywhere. He has an access all areas pass, which I never had. And now at my age, I can't suddenly change that viewpoint. I will, no matter what happens. If I'm walking down a street in Glasgow or even in Guildford late at night and there's a bunch of white guys there, I will always think, are they looking at me funny? Because I felt it. I've had it. I've experienced that through no fault of my own. People will just turn on you. And how do you rationalize that? And then you grow up. We talked about how do you rationalize these two sides? How do you rationalize the fact that the people of this country, you're brought up to lionize this man, and at the same time you know that he's responsible by omission for the deaths of 3 million people who look like you? How do you reconcile those two facts together? And I think that goes to the heart of let's call it the second generation experience. You always know there's a certain level of hypocrisy in everything you're told, whereas somebody who comes from the white majority probably doesn't realize that at as an early age as somebody like Derek or I would. We talk about things like the fear of the police. We talk about issues of why ethnic minorities don't get vaccinated to the same degree. And it goes back to this fundamental point, which is we have been on the receiving end of abuse from these institutions, whether it is the police, whether it is, people effectively conducting trials on ethnic minorities in the past. And that lives with us because that is what we've been taught. My father, when I first got an organ donor card, told me to rip it up because his fear was that should an ethnic minority go in, the doctors would be less likely to save him. They'd rather harvest his organs and give them to someone else. Now, that might sound stupid, but it was a fear that my father lived with, and part of it is transfer. And when my son comes to me with his first organ card, how am I going to react? I don't know the answer to that. But this is what it feels like when you grow up in a different culture, in a culture that you don't completely fit into.
It sounds like what you're describing is... But what you're describing is like an atmospheric pressure. And you're talking about the microclimate that you've written about as well, something that affects everything you do and the way you are able to be in the world. Derek, is that something that you can relate to as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I was a lot more angry in the past and I had to contain it because, as Abir says, it's really, really exhausting. There was a period where, I just couldn't really function because I just couldn't understand how certain things were allowed to happen. When I was in university, I was a Pan-African, and there was just so much information to be taken in, so many things that I just hadn't heard about, and you just can't, you just can't understand why how this happened, why people were thinking this way, you know. And then it got to the point where, you know, the people that I would deifying, like that I was deifying, people like Mugabe and Kwame Nkrumah and people like that, and then you realize that they've done their share of wicked things as well. So I just became very confused, and again, this is why I really try not to get involved with politics, because people talk about it like it's black and white, and it just never is, because people aren't. People's behaviors are so confusing and so contradictory. So yeah, I've really hesitated to think about certain things and engage with them, you know, too much. So for example, if I get invited onto a panel or onto like the news or something like that to talk about race, I always decline. Because if I really allow myself to slip back into that, I'll just be shouting all the time. I'll just be absolutely furious. You know, I won't be able to think properly. I won't be able to engage with anyone properly, because I'll just be so angry all the time. Do you know what I mean? The fact that someone can say to you, get over the Bengal famine, or get over the enslavement of a conservative over 100 million people of color. Get over it. I don't understand how anyone can say get over it when I don't think anyone can even get their head around it in the first place. You know, we actually haven't. I don't think the mind can actually process that amount of death and amount of just wickedness happening to other people for no other reason except for, you know, economic growth. And, you know, because obviously one thing that is said, and I really agree with it, is that, you know, people who enslaved blacks didn't enslave them because they were racist. They became racist because they wanted to enslave them. It was a justification to do what they were wanting to do. They had to try and use philosophy and science to basically say these people are subhuman, so it's okay for us to do this for our economic benefit. And I guess in some kind of perverted way, that goes back to what Abir was saying, that people generally do have their hearts in the right place before they're influenced by something else that causes them to do this, before they're led against another person, or they're told to fear this person, or just you can get this from, you know, when there's any kind of opportunity to exploit another person. I think for many reasons, people will jump on that and want to exploit and try their best to justify it by any means possible. So yeah, there's definitely,
I think you're right.
Sorry.
I think what's really interesting about the way you guys are answering these questions is, I think it's bringing me to an understanding of how and why you've approached this commission like you have. Like, Abir, you've got a long history of writing about this stuff, but you're kind of energized by the conversation to bring this stuff to this commission, and the idea of weathering, you know, is something that you've felt your entire life, that you're weathering a pressure, and that now you can sort of perhaps more like explicitly speak about. Whereas Derek, I can understand why you don't want to speak about race, because we shouldn't expect discussions of race from people who are from racialized backgrounds. Like, why can't an artist just be an artist? You know, why do you have to have this political dimension or racial dimension to your work? And in your response to the commission, you've come from a completely different angle. You've come from a very personal angle. Again, was that something that you thought about and you positioned yourself in that way, or is that just how it came out in response to the commission?
Yeah, I kind of just wanted to reflect on the last few months and fictionalize it in a way that I thought was interesting, and also kind of toy with the idea of trying to draw meaning from absolutely everything, trying to draw inspiration from absolutely everything, even when a lot of the time there is no meaning. It's just absolute chaos. which was the overall thing that I was trying to get across, just how chaotic everything is, and to try and draw meaning from it and write from it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, definitely.
I can read in your piece as well what you're talking about, of people, nothing being black and white. There aren't good people and bad people. We all exist in this grey area. And I also loved a bit about the mere act of you thinking about a dream, or your protagonist thinking about a dream to write it down, drains the dream of its moment. It drains it of any meaning because you've already decided you're going to write about it. And that brings me to perhaps what might be an unanswerable question, which is, what is the role of a writer in times like this? Do we have a particular responsibility, or is our responsibility to step back and offer a little bit more nuance than we might? Jenny Offel actually wrote a piece last year for the National Centre for Writing, which kicked off this whole project. And she spoke about how to help people in times of a continuing crisis. And if I can quote her very briefly, she said, "One of the first principles is to anticipate and answer questions before they have been asked." Now, is this what we as writers have to do in times like this? Do we, when we're caught in the kind of storm waters of such like swift and unanticipated change, do we have a responsibility that isn't there in less turbulent times? Or is our responsibility not to try and anticipate anything? Abir, I'm going to throw that to you first. Sorry about that.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to answer this on a personal level. I wouldn't dream to be able to speak for writers. Personally, I don't feel I have an obligation to write for anybody other than me. I write, as I say, it's therapy. It's to help me make sense of the world that I live in. In that sense, if I write something that is interesting or helpful in any way to others, that's great. And it's always good because it provides me with a living. But my objective is not, I can't write something to somebody else's purpose and have it be authentic. The only way that I can be a writer is writing about what animates me. I have to write my truth or my stories. I don't feel I have an obligation to write about a particular. I will only write about it if I am angered or motivated by it. So the question is, how will I reflect on this year and what's happened? How will I reflect on the year that we've lived through in my writing? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I certainly won't. It certainly won't be something that I would imagine will figure greatly because of the trauma. I just don't feel at the moment that I could write anything that would meaningfully help me or contribute anything about this year that other people couldn't do far better than me. So for me, it's about taking the lessons, and I take the lessons, but I take the lessons that occur to me. As I say, the things that affected me this year have been the guilt. They've been the positive benefits. The things that we've seen come out of it. The resurgence of this Black Lives Matter. This resurgence of the fact that you can have different viewpoints, or that the history that we've been taught might not be real, and that will play out in my work. But do I have an obligation to write about this to make sense of the world to anybody else? I don't feel that's my role. I don't feel I'm qualified to do that. I can only write about the things that animate me.
That's a great answer. And Derek, how about you?
Hey,
what do you? What do you feel the role of a writer is in these kind of times? And do you think it is different to the less, when we're in the middle of less upheaval, or do you feel different in what your role is now?
Yeah, I agree with Abir. I don't think that could ever say that all writers have a role. Everybody writes for different reasons. I personally never feel any kind of obligation to write about any particular thing. I feel pressure sometimes to write about particular subjects. But I've never felt like by me not writing about it, I'm doing something wrong, or I'm betraying something, or betraying Black people or people of color by not addressing issues that the Times calls pertinent. I just when I write, one thing I'm trying to do is usually anyway is entertain myself. But then with the collection I've just finished, for some reason I did actually feel some sort of obligation when I decided I was going to write it. I did feel kind of like I had to do this for my mother, my aunties, sisters. I felt like I had to do that. I never generally feel like that as a writer, but for this particular project, when I started it and editing it and going through it, I did feel like I need to make sure I'm doing this properly. I need to make sure that this is almost kind of like an archive that people can look back on and understand, or people can read and say, wow, I feel the same thing that I felt. I really miss my mum. Let me talk to my mum. Let me try and have a conversation with my mum. Let me ask her how she's feeling, and not walk away when she says, oh, I'm fine. You try and keep trying to probe that, because there's always more beneath the surface. So I think, yeah, that project's probably the only time I've ever felt that. But as in general, I never feel an obligation to write about anything. As I said, I usually just write to try and entertain myself.
I know you probably think you're talking about entirely different projects, but to me, in the things you've been writing about this past year, it feels like it is truly all about interpersonal connection. And Derek, if yours is your connection with your mum, Abir, your connection is with people who perhaps don't appreciate your background and haven't had your experiences. So you're trying to relate to them as well. You're trying to get them to relate to you. So perhaps a kind of responsibility on us all to bring people together a little bit more, whether that's people we know or people we don't know, is something we can take away from this. That was my attempt at a tiny wrap up for what has been a very wide-ranging conversation. Thank you so much, guys, for bringing so much of yourselves to this chat as well. I know it can be often quite draining when you have to talk about such subjects. So thank you so much. And thank you for writing such beautiful pieces as well. I'm sure everyone who's watching today is going to go and enjoy them now. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.